18. More power to the princes.
赋予王子们更多的权利，
Crowning the princes as uncontested rulers.
封王为无争议的统治者。
On May 21, 1997, the lower house of the Japanese Diet passed the first revision of the new Bank of Japan law in half a century. It was passed by the upper house in June and became effective on April 1, 1998. The old law had given the democratically elected government ways and means to influence the central bank, and it had named support of national policy as the main policy objective. The new law made the Bank of Japan legally independent, with only minimal reporting requirements to the government and the Ministry of Finance.
1997年5月21日，日本国会下议院通过了半个世纪以来的首次日本银行法修订案。该法案于6月在上议院通过，并于1998年4月1日生效。旧法赋予了民主选举的政府影响央行的途径和手段，并将支持国家政策定为主要政策目标。新法使日本银行在法律上独立，只需向政府和财政部做最少的报告。
The new law says that the Bank of Japan's independence in formulating and implementing monetary policy shall be respected. 2 paragraphs down it says again, in implementing this law, the bank's independence in carrying out its operations shall receive sufficient consideration. 1. There are no more government representatives among the members of the new policy board. The ultimate threat of dismissal of the governor is gone. As the official report on the change of the BOJ law recommended, the officers shall not be dismissed for holding opinions different from that of the government. Article 25 states, executives of the BOJ shall not be dismissed against their will during their term of office. Even if Bank of Japan staff are found guilty of misconduct, all the government can do is ask the Bank of Japan itself to take necessary measures to correct such misconduct. In the new law, the power of the minister to conduct on-site inspections shall be abolished. 2. Most of all, the broad authority of the Minister of Finance to issue directions to the Bank of Japan and appoint its comptroller shall be abolished.
新法规定，应尊重日本银行制定和实施货币政策的独立性。两段之后，他又说，在实施这个法律时，应充分考虑到银行在执行其业务时的独立性。一新的政策委员会中再也没有政府代表，对行长的最终解职威胁已经消失。 正如日本银行法变更的官方报告所建议的，官员不应因持有与政府不同的观点而被解职。第25条规定，日本银行的高级管理人员在任期内不得违背其意愿被解职。即使日本银行的员工被发现有不当行为，政府也只能要求日本银行采取必要措施纠正这种不当行为。在新法中，财政部长进行现场检查的权利应被废除。最重要的是， 财政部长对日本银行发出指示和任命其审计长的广泛权力应被废除。
After half a century of behind-the-scenes battles with the Ministry of Finance and the politicians, the princes had reached their goal. The extensive powers that they had quietly enjoyed throughout the post-war era had now become official and perfectly legal. They had moved up from being backstage manipulators to being the crowned rulers of Japan's economy.
经过半个世纪与财政部和政治家的幕后斗争，王子们达到了他们的目标。他们在战后时期一直悄然享有的广泛权利，现在已经正式并完全合法化。他们从幕后操纵者晋升为日本经济的锋芒统治者。
Waking up to reality.
面对现实的觉醒。
Not long after this momentous law changed, the politicians woke up to the reality of what they had done. From early 1999 onward, more and more politicians realized that throughout the 1990s, the economy could have been stimulated quite easily by an expansion in central bank credit creation. Throughout 1999, members of the government and the LDP called on the Bank of Japan to increase the credit supply by buying government bonds. Their voices became even louder in early 2001, when the LDP called for quantitative easing by the BOJ.
在这个重大法律变更不久后，政治家们开始意识到他们所做的事情的现实。从1999年初开始，越来越多的政治家意识到，在整个90年代，通过扩大央行信贷创造，经济本可以很容易地得到刺激。在1999年期间，政府和自民党的成员呼吁日本银行通过购买政府债券来增加信贷供应。他们的呼声在2001年初变得更为响亮。 当时，自民党呼吁日本银行进行量化宽松。
They were too late. Having just been made independent the previous year, the Bank of Japan saw this as the first challenge to its new powers and vigorously rebuffed the politicians. Governor Hayami and his deputy, Yutaka Yamaguchi, denied that any such quantitative easing was possible or would be effective. Throughout 1999, the BOJ failed to increase bond or commercial paper (CP) purchases. Many politicians, not used to a publicly recalcitrant central bank, were infuriated by the cold refusal of the Bank of Japan to budge. But it was too late. The politicians had decided to cut off their right hand by voluntarily giving up control over monetary policy.
他们来得太晚了。日本银行在前一年刚刚独立，他将此视为对其新权力的首次挑战，并且强烈反驳了政治家们。行长素水和他的副手山口富士也否认了任何所谓的量化宽松是可能的或者会有效。在1999年的整个过程中，日本银行未能增加债券或商业票据 CP 的购买。许多不习惯公开抗议的中央银行的政治家们对日本银行冷酷的拒绝感到愤怒，但是已经太晚了。政治家们决定割掉他们的右手，自愿放弃对货币政策的控制。
The politicians were not the only ones to realize just how powerless they had become. Throughout 1999, and against the expectations of the majority of currency forecasters, the yen strengthened. Worried about the economy and about the employment situation of its citizens, the Ministry of Finance ordered drastic foreign exchange intervention. But, as we saw, in a repeat performance of the events of early 1995, the Bank of Japan sterilized all foreign exchange interventions by selling its bonds to the domestic economy. Just as in 1995, it over-sterilized. Instead of creating credit, the central bank was tightening it at the fastest rate yet seen in the post-war era. This strengthened the yen back to yen 100/dollar by the end of 1999.
政治家们并不是唯一意识到他们变得多么无力的人。在整个1999年，以及对大多数货币预测家的期望，日元升值。财政部担心经济和公民的就业状况，下令进行大规模的外汇干预。但是，正如我们所看到的，在1995年初的事件的重演中，日本银行通过向国内经济出售其债券来消除所有外汇干预。就像在1995年一样，它过度消除了。中央银行并没有创造信贷，而是以战后时代尚未见过的最快速度收紧了信贷，这使日元在1999年底回升到每美元100日元。
Those Ministry of Finance officials and politicians who went back to study the new Bank of Japan law could find nothing to fault the central bank on, for the only explicit policy goal that the law prescribed was price stability. Since there was no inflation, the central bank and its decision-makers argued they were fulfilling their duty.
那些回去研究新的日本银行法的财政部官员和政治家们找不到任何可以指责中央银行的地方，因为该法律规定的唯一明确的政策目标就是价格稳定。由于没有通货膨胀，中央银行及其决策者们辩称，他们正在履行他们的职责。
The lobbying by leading Bank of Japan staff of Diet politicians in 1996 and 1997 had paid off. At the time, BOJ insiders such as Yutaka Yamaguchi, later deputy governor, and Toshihiko Fukui had spearheaded the campaign that blamed all of Japan's economic ills on the Ministry of Finance. The grounds for this argument had already been laid by Mino, who had devoted much of his public life after his 1994 retirement to lobbying in numerous speeches and meetings for a change in the Bank of Japan law. Given his reputation as the Robin Hood who had pricked the bubble to help poor people, many listened to what this selfless man had to say.
日本银行的主要工作人员在1996年和1997年向国会议员进行游说，已经取得了回报。当时，日本银行的内部人士如山口富士、后来的副行长和福井俊彦领导了一场运动，将日本所有的经济问题都归咎于财政部。这个论点的依据已经由三重野，他在1994年退休后，将他的公共生活的大部分时间都用于在许多演讲和会议中游说改变日本银行法。鉴于他作为帮助穷人刺破泡沫的罗宾汉的声誉，许多人都在听这个无私的人要说什么。
Sovereignty for the Princes.
王子的主权。
There was another reason why the politicians felt the case for an independent central bank was sound. To implement changes in Japan, it is always helpful to be able to refer to the experience of other countries that had already made the change. Then it could be argued that Japan had to follow the international trend. Japanese politicians had been trained in the post-war era to pay attention to the trends set by the international community. So Bank of Japan officials helpfully pointed out that parliaments in many of the advanced industrialized countries had already made their central banks independent.
政治家们认为独立的中央银行是合理的另一个原因是，要在日本实施变革，能够参考已经进行了变革的其他国家的经验，总是有帮助的。然后可以争辩说，日本必须跟随国际趋势。日本的政治家们在战后时代被训练去关注由国际社会设定的趋势，所以日本银行的官员们乐于指出，许多先进的工业化国家的议会已经使他们的中央银行独立。
The most forceful case in favor of central bank independence was made in the Maastricht Treaty of 1992, which laid the foundations for monetary union in Europe. The treaty described the role and function of the European Central Bank (ECB), which started operations as scheduled on January 1, 1999, and which is legally the most independent central bank in the world. According to the treaty, the ECB was going to be totally independent from and unaccountable to any government and any democratically elected assembly.
最有力的中央银行独立性论证出现在1992年的马斯特里赫特条约中，该条约为欧洲的货币联盟奠定了基础。该条约描述了欧洲中央银行 ECB 的角色和功能，该银行如期开始运营于1999年1月1日，并且在法律上是世界上最独立的中央银行。根据该条约， ECB 将完全独立于任何政府和任何民主选举的议会，对他们不负任何责任。
The Maastricht Treaty quickly became the new goal to aspire to amongst central bankers all over the world. Bank of Japan staff specifically referred to it as the prime example of a modern central bank law that enshrines central bank independence from democratic control and only set the task of ensuring price stability. 3 Proponents of the Maastricht Treaty based their case on the experience of the German central bank, the Bundesbank. Since that treaty was new, and most central banks in other countries had only recently become independent, proponents of Bank of Japan independence ultimately also referred to the case of Germany, where central bank independence had the longest history. Based on frequent reference to the experience of the Bundesbank, Bank of Japan staff created the impression that the proposed new Bank of Japan law was within internationally accepted best practice, and Japan merely had to follow the global standard.
马斯特里赫特条约很快成为全球中央银行家们追求的新目标。日本银行的工作人员特别将其称为现代中央银行法的典范。该法确立了中央银行从民主控制中独立，并只设定了确保价格稳定的任务。马斯特里赫特条约的支持者们以德国中央银行及德意志联邦银行的经验为依据。由于该条约是新的，而且其他国家的大多数中央银行只是最近才变得独立，因此日本银行独立性的支持者们最终也引用了德国的案例，那里的中央银行独立性有着最长的历史。基于对德意志联邦银行经验的频繁引用，日本银行的工作人员给人留下了这样的印象，即拟议的新日本银行法是符合国际公认的最佳实践的，日本只需遵循全球标准。
The German experience.
德国的经验。
The experience of the Bundesbank remains such a focal point of discussions about central bank independence that it deserves much closer scrutiny, which is the purpose of the next chapter. It is well known that the German central bank, then called the Reichsbank, created too much money in 1922 and 1923 and hence caused hyperinflation. It is normally thought that this is why the post-war German constitution made the Bundesbank largely, though not completely, independent from the government. And indeed, the Bundesbank's track record is very good. It is this experience that probably convinced most parliamentarians in Japan, as well as other countries, that it was the right thing to make the central bank independent.
德意志联邦银行的经验仍然是关于中央银行独立性讨论的焦点，因此值得更仔细的审查，这是下一章的目的。众所周知，德国中央银行当时被称为德意志帝国银行，在1922年和1923年创造了过多的货币，从而导致了恶性通货膨胀。通常认为，这就是为什么战后的德国宪法使德意志联邦银行在很大程度上，虽然不完全独立于政府。事实上， 德意志联邦银行的业绩非常好。这种经验可能使日本以及其他国家的大多数议员相信，使中央银行独立是正确的。
Yet the German case may not be representative. The chain of logic that led to an independent Bundesbank was as follows. The authors of the German Constitution looked back at German monetary policy and determined the biggest policy mistakes. No doubt that was the hyperinflation of the early 1920s. They then set out to ascertain its cause, concluding it was the legal status of the central bank that was the problem. Hence, the Bundesbank's status was determined.
然而，德国的案例可能并不具有代表性。导致德意志联邦银行独立的逻辑链如下：德国宪法的作者回顾了德国的货币政策，并确定了最大的政策错误。毫无疑问，那就是20世纪20年代初的恶性通货膨胀。然后他们开始确定其原因，得出的结论是中央银行的法律地位是问题所在，因此确定了德意志联邦银行的地位。
Mino and his fellow officers at the Bank of Japan boiled this down to the formula that the Bundesbank's success was due to its very strong legal independence. They then urged politicians to adopt these conclusions without proper reflection on the true status of the Bundesbank and the chain of thinking that had led the Germans to their conclusions. It was akin to copying steep roofs for houses from Germany and introducing them in Tokyo without realizing that the steep roofs were made for areas with heavy snowfall. If Japan was to truly learn from the German experience, it would, like Germany, have to look back at past monetary policy, determine the biggest policy mistake, find its cause, and then implement a law that prevents any recurrence of that problem.
日本银行的三重野和他的同事们将这一点归结为德意志联邦银行的成功归因于其非常强大的法律独立性。然后他们敦促政治家们在没有对德意志联邦银行的真实地位和导致德国人得出结论的思维链进行适当反思的情况下接受这些结论。这就像从德国复制陡峭的屋顶并在东京引入它们，却没有意识到陡峭的屋顶是为了应对大雪区域而制造的。如果日本真的要从德国的经验中学习，那么他就必须像德国一样回顾过去的货币政策，确定最大的政策错误，找出其原因，然后实施一项法律，防止该问题再次发生。
Doing this for Germany, we get quite a different story from the above. As we will see in the next chapter, it turns out that the monetary policy mistakes of the 1920s and early 1930s were made by a Reichsbank that was totally independent and unaccountable to the German government or parliament. This is why, contrary to popular belief, the Bundesbank was made less independent and more accountable than the Reichsbank.
对于德国来说，我们得到的故事与上述内容大相径庭。在下一章中，我们将看到1920年代和1930年代初的货币政策错误是由一个完全独立且对德国政府或议会没有任何问责的德意志帝国银行所犯下的。这就是为什么，与普遍的观点相反，德国联邦银行的独立性被削弱，问责性被增强，比德意志帝国银行更为如此。
If it ain't broke, don't fix it, Japan's inflation record.
如果没坏，就别修，日本的通胀记录。
Furthermore, by referring to the German experience, Bank of Japan staff insinuate that inflation is the biggest problem of monetary policy. While this may have been the case in Germany, in Japan inflation has not been the problem. Compared to virtually any other country, post-war Japan has enjoyed one of the lowest inflation rates. In the 20 years from 1976 to 1996, consumer prices rose by an average of just 2.9% per year. In the decade from 1986 to 1996, they rose only 1.2%. This is significantly lower than the inflation in the United States, which averaged 5.3% in the 20-year period and 3.5% in the 10-year period. Many people are surprised to find that Japan's inflation has been lower even than Germany's, the reputed model for low inflation. German inflation averaged 3.1% over the 20 years from 1976 to 1996 and 2.4% over the decade from 1986 to 1996. The latter figure is exactly twice as high as the Japanese inflation rate over that decade. 4.
此外，通过引用德国的经验，日本银行的工作人员暗示，通胀是货币政策的最大问题。虽然这在德国可能是这样，但在日本，通胀并不是问题。与几乎任何其他国家相比，战后的日本享有最低的通胀率之一。 从1976年到1996年的20年间，消费者价格平均每年上涨 2.9%。从1986年到1996年的10年间，它们只上涨了 1.2%。这比美国的通胀率低得多。美国的通胀率在20年期间平均为 5.3%， 在10年期间为 3.5%。许多人惊讶地发现，日本的通胀率甚至低于德国，德国被誉为低通胀的典范。从1976年到1996年的20年间，德国的通胀率平均为 3.1%， 从1986年到1996年的10年间为 2.4%。后者的数字正好是日本在那个10年期间的通胀率的2倍。4.
Japan's inflation record is impeccable. It would make the Bundesbank jealous. Since nobody criticized the Bundesbank's inflation record or suggested that it needed another legal change to make it even more powerful, why did the Japanese parliament change the Bank of Japan law?
日本的通胀记录无可挑剔，这会让德国联邦银行嫉妒。既然没有人批评德国联邦银行的通胀记录，或者建议它需要进行另一次法律变更以使其更加强大，那么为什么日本议会要改变日本银行法呢？
Japan's problem: dramatic boom-bust cycles.
日本的问题：剧烈的经济繁荣衰退周期。
While inflation has not been Japan's biggest monetary policy problem, this is not to say that monetary policy has been without serious flaws. We have seen that the biggest problem of Japanese monetary policy has been the creation of boom and bust economic cycles. This started with the stop-and-go growth pattern and the asset deflation crisis of the 1960s. Then there was a huge speculative boom in the early 1970s, which ended in a deep recession in 1974 and the following years. Growth then accelerated in the late 1970s, only to slump again in the early 1980s. In the second half of the 1980s, the biggest economic bubble on record was created in Japan. This was followed by a decade of recession and record high unemployment. Parallel with these momentous swings in economic growth, the economy has also suffered from extreme gyrations of the exchange rate, such as the swing of the yen to yen 79.75/dollar in April 1995, after which it collapsed by 80% to hit yen 147/dollar in mid-1998.
虽然通胀并不是日本最大的货币政策问题，但这并不是说货币政策没有严重的缺陷。我们已经看到，日本货币政策的最大问题是创造了经济繁荣衰退的周期，这始于停滞增长的模式和1960年代的资产通缩危机，然后是1970年代初的巨大投机热潮，这在1974年及其后的几年结束于深度衰退，然后在1970年代末增长再次加速，只是在1980年代初再次下滑。在1980年代后半期，日本创造了有记录以来最大的经济泡沫，这之后是10年的衰退和创纪录的高失业率。与这些巨大的经济增长波动相伴的是，经济也受到了汇率极端波动的影响。例如，在1995年4月，日元对美元的汇率达到了 79.75 日元美元，之后它下跌了 80%， 在1998年中期达到了147日元美元。
In this book, we have seen that the rate of economic growth, asset price movements, and exchange rates have been largely determined by the Bank of Japan. 5 using its extralegal window guidance credit controls. In the 1980s, the central bank forced the banks to lend excessively to real estate speculators. In the 1990s, it restricted credit and burst the bubble. It then failed to increase credit creation and actively disrupted government policies to stimulate the economy. In addition to prolonging the recession, the Bank of Japan at key junctures manipulated the exchange rate to strengthen the yen. The considerable national debt resulting from these blows to the economy has also been the responsibility of the Bank of Japan.
在这本书中，我们看到日本的经济增长率、资产价格走势和汇率大多由日本银行决定。在1980年代，日本中央银行利用其超法定的窗口指导信贷控制，强迫银行过度向房地产投机者放贷。到了1990年代，它限制了信贷并破灭了泡沫。然后，它未能增加信贷创造，并积极破坏政府刺激经济的政策。除了延长经济衰退，日本银行在关键时刻还操纵汇率以强化日元。 由于这些对经济的打击产生的巨额国债也是日本银行的责任。
The cause: too much independence.
原因：过度独立。
Did the Bank of Japan undertake these disastrous policies because it lacked independence from the government or the Ministry of Finance? There is no disagreement about the consensus view that the Bank of Japan was not fully in charge of interest rate policies. However, we have found that it was not interest rates that were responsible for these costly gyrations in economic activity. Instead, they were driven by the quantity of credit creation. There has been no evidence that the Ministry of Finance, the government, or other agencies had any influence over the Bank of Japan's quantity of credit policies. To the contrary, we found that a small number of insiders at the Bank of Japan independently determined these policies without being held accountable for their actions. Instead of being demoted for their policies, the creators of the bubble, Mino and Fukui, were promoted to governor and deputy governor, respectively. Fukui was still vying for the top job in 2002, though his chances have been damaged by increasing public awareness of his role in the creation of the bubble. Thus, the Bank of Japan's biggest problem has been not lack of independence, but rather excessive independence and lack of accountability in terms of the key monetary policy tool, the quantity of credit.
日本银行是否因为缺乏对政府或财政部的独立性而采取了这些灾难性的政策？关于日本银行并未完全掌控利率政策的共识观点没有任何争议。然而，我们发现造成经济活动昂贵波动的并非利率，而是信贷创造的数量。没有证据表明财政部、政府或其他机构对日本银行的信贷政策有任何影响。相反，我们发现日本银行内部的少数人独立决定了这些政策，而他们的行为并未受到追究。泡沫的创造者三重野和福井，他们的政策并未导致他们被降职，反而被提升为行长和副行长。福井在2002年仍在争取最高职位，尽管他的机会已经因为公众对他在泡沫创造中的角色的认识增加而受损。因此，日本银行最大的问题并非缺乏独立性，而是过度的独立性和在关键的货币政策工具信贷数量方面的缺乏问责。
The power of the princes.
王子们的权利。
The lesson from German and Japanese history is that instead of increasing its independence, the power and independence of the Bank of Japan should have been reduced. As politicians have found out, there is little they can now do to influence the central bank. All the Bank of Japan is required to do in exchange for its far-reaching powers is to establish relevant procedures to prepare a report every 6 months, stating the policy board's monetary policy decisions and the status of its implementation. Moreover, the bank shall endeavor to publicly disclose the contents of its decisions and decision-making process regarding monetary policies. In other words, the central bank merely needs to report on a few topics of its choice. Neither the Diet, the government, nor the Ministry of Finance, not to mention ordinary citizens, can do anything to change its monetary policy. The only policy objective in the new law is price stability. In the name of trying to achieve price stability, the central bank can do what it wants, and nobody can interfere, short of scrapping the new law.
从德国和日本的历史中，我们可以得到的教训是，日本银行的权力和独立性应该被削弱，而不是增强。如今，政治家们发现他们对中央银行几乎无能为力。日本银行只需要做的是每6个月建立相关程序，准备一份报告，说明政策委员会的货币政策决定和实施情况。此外，银行应努力公开披露其关于货币政策的决定内容和决策过程。换句话说，中央银行只需要报告他选择的几个主题，国会、政府、财政部，更不用说普通公民，都无法改变其货币政策。新法律中唯一的政策目标是价格稳定，以实现价格稳定的名义，中央银行可以做任何他想做的事，除非废除新法律，否则没有人可以干预。
The increased disclosure of its decision-making process remains a farce. Short summaries of the policy board meetings are now published on the internet after a time lag. But from studying these, it is clear that the crucial decisions are not even discussed by the policy board. Every month, the Bank of Japan decides how much credit it will create. This decision affects economic growth, asset prices, and quite immediately, the exchange rate. Yet in the years since publication of policy board minutes, this decision has never been discussed explicitly by the policy board, which is preoccupied with discussions about interest rate policy, the BOJ's long-standing smokescreen, or bank's reserves. The more recent decoy point 6 from this it follows that the board, staffed with Bank of Japan insiders and largely malleable outsiders, is still not the location of real decision-making power, as it has never been in the post-war history of the Bank of Japan.
其决策过程的披露增加仍然是一场闹剧。政策委员会的会议简要记录现在在一段时间后会在互联网上公布，但从这些记录中可以看出，关键的决定甚至没有在政策委员会上讨论过。每个月，日本银行都会决定它将创造多少信贷，这个决定影响着经济增长、资产价格和相当直接的汇率。然而，在政策委员会会议记录公布以来的这些年里，这个决定从未在政策委员会上明确讨论过。委员会更关注的是利率政策，这是日本银行长期以来的烟幕，或者是银行的储备，这是更近期的诱饵。由此可见，这个由日本银行内部人员和大多数易受影响的外部人员组成的委员会，仍然不是真正决策权的所在，这在日本银行的战后历史上从未发生过。
Information management.
信息管理。
Without outside checks on their actions, central banks are unlikely to divulge much about their actual policies to the public. To the contrary, their emphasis on interest rates and public discussions has served as disinformation. In Japan, an important tool for the propagation of misleading descriptions of the Bank of Japan's policy is the Central Bank's Institute for Monetary and Economic Studies. This institute is not involved in briefing actual decision-makers at the Bank of Japan about economic conditions. Instead, it produces academic studies and invites foreign and domestic academics on well-paid research projects and conferences. Milton Friedman, for many years one of the academics invited by central banks, concluded that in the case of the U.S. Federal Reserve, there was no sincere interest in scholarly activity of the type that searches for the truth and attempts to draw suitable lessons from it. Instead, he found that economic research and exchanges with academic scholars were mere window dressing, employed to support or cover up the central bank's actual policies. Point 7.
如果没有外部对他们行动的制约，中央银行不太可能向公众透露太多关于他们实际政策的信息。相反，他们在公开讨论中对利率的强调反而起到了误导的作用。在日本，误导公众对日本银行政策理解的一个重要工具就是该银行的货币经济研究所。这个研究所并未参与向日本银行的实际决策者介绍经济状况，而是进行学术研究，并邀请国内外学者参与高薪的研究项目和会议。多年来，一直受到中央银行邀请的学者米尔顿·弗里德曼得出结论：美国联邦储备系统并未真正对寻求真理并试图从中吸取适当教训的学术活动产生诚挚的兴趣。相反，他发现经济研究和与学术学者的交流只是粉饰，用来支持或掩盖中央银行的实际政策。7.
Another respected researcher of central bank policies, Oxford University's James Forder, concluded upon close scrutiny of the activities of the European Central Bank's publications that they are merely self-serving. Point 8. Already in the early 1970s, researchers had argued that central banks could be expected to argue that monetary policy could achieve rather little, and always to offer explanations of events that would diminish their own responsibility for policy failures, while taking credit for successes. Secondly, they could be expected to try to maximize their policy leeway and minimize accountability by presenting different explanations of the same phenomenon at different times, presumably with the implication that only they knew which explanation was applicable at which time. Then, depending on the explanation offered, different policies could be chosen. A useful component of policy presentation would always be the announcement of a variety of different policy targets or indicators. While giving the appearance of transparency, the central bank's discretion would then be increased by being able to refer to different indicators at different times so as to justify the desired policy. 9. Forder concluded from its publications that all these things can be seen in the behavior of the ECB today.
另一位受人尊敬的中央银行政策研究者，牛津大学的詹姆斯·福德尔，在仔细审查欧洲中央银行出版物的活动后得出结论，他们只是在为自己服务。早在20世纪70年代初，研究人员就曾争论，人们可以预期中央银行会辩称货币政策能够实现的很少， 并且总是提供能够减轻他们对政策失败的责任的事件解释，同时为成功的政策抢功。其次，他们可能会试图通过在不同时间提供同一现象的不同解释，大概的含义是，只有他们知道在哪个时间适用哪种解释，然后根据提供的解释可以选择不同的政策。政策呈现的一个有用组成部分总是宣布各种不同的政策目标或指标，虽然给人一种透明的印象，但中央银行可以在不同时间引用不同的指标，以此来证明所需的政策，从而增加了中央银行的自由裁量权。久福德尔从其出版物中得出结论，所有这些都可以在今天的欧洲中央银行的行为中看到。
These findings are very much consistent with the activities of the Bank of Japan's Institute for Monetary and Economic Studies. A glance at its research output reveals that it focuses on propagating economic analyses that are hardly relevant for the decision makers. Any issues of real importance, such as the role of the quantity of credit or the decision-making process concerning the quantity of credit, remain out of bounds. The Institute never published a serious analysis of the role of window guidance in the creation and propagation of the bubble. Instead, the economists employed by the Bank of Japan produce writings that give the impression that monetary policy is made and can be fully understood by focusing on interest rates. The Bank of Japan's hired economists have even been producing research that suggests that central banks have practically no power. In his publications throughout the 1990s, Kunio Okina, currently the head of the institute, claims that the Bank of Japan cannot control the quantity of money or credit in the economy. According to Okina, money is always determined by the demand for it, and the problem has been that during the 1990s there has not been enough demand for money. Instead, lowering interest rates has been a sufficient response of the Bank of Japan during the 1990s.
这些发现与日本银行货币经济研究所的活动非常一致。看一眼他的研究成果就会发现，它主要是在传播对决策者来说几乎无关紧要的经济分析。任何真正重要的问题，如信贷数量的角色或决定信贷数量的决策过程，都被排除在外。该研究所从未发布过关于窗口指导在泡沫产生和传播中的作用的严肃分析。相反，日本银行雇佣的经济学家们撰写的文章给人的印象是，货币政策是通过关注利率来制定和完全理解的。日本银行雇佣的经济学家甚至进行了研究，暗示中央银行几乎没有权利。在1990年代的出版物中，目前该研究所的负责人冲中邦男声称，日本银行无法控制经济中的货币或信贷数量。据冲中邦男称，货币总是由对它的需求决定的，问题在于在1990年代对货币的需求不足。相反，降低利率已经是日本银行在1990年代的充分回应。
Okina failed to point out that the world's largest demand for money was indeed located in Japan, where the government desperately demanded money and where the majority of small firms have remained cash-strapped for almost a decade. Yet the Bank of Japan refused to extend any money to them. As Friedman and others have explained in detail, such arguments serve central banks to fend off any criticism of their policies and thus allow them to pursue their own agendas without serious accountability. Point 10.
冲中邦男未能指出，世界上对货币需求最大的地方实际上就在日本，那里的政府急需货币，而大多数小企业在近10年间一直资金紧张。然而，日本银行拒绝向他们提供任何资金。正如弗里德曼和其他人详细解释的，这样的论点使中央银行能够抵挡对他们政策的任何批评，从而让他们在没有严格问责的情况下追求自己的议程。是。
It can probably be said that most of the staff at the Institute are not even aware that they are being used as a smokescreen by the Princes. Many are hired economists who have been shielded from actual experience of the implementation of monetary policy. Instead, they have been sent to the United States to gain PhDs in the type of theoretical economics that sees little role for the existence of money and thus provides an ideal diversion from the important facts of reality.
可以说，研究所的大多数员工甚至都没有意识到他们被当作烟幕被利用。许多被雇佣的经济学家从未亲身经历过货币政策的实施。相反，他们被送到美国获得博士学位，研究的是那种对货币存在的角色视而不见的理论经济学，这为他们从重要的现实事实中转移注意力提供了理想的幌子。
The production of misleading and one-sided propaganda is not the only way in which central banks attempt to reduce their accountability. Indeed, the scope for the management of information by central banks is substantial. Anyone who wants to monitor the policies of a central bank needs to have accurate information. But the data needed to assess the economy and central bank policies are produced by none other than the central bank itself. This creates a conflict of interest. It is exacerbated by the view, sometimes expressed by economists and central bankers, that a central bank should be vague about the economy and its policy intentions. The Bank of Japan has been excelling on this count. In April 1998, when it gained legal independence, the Bank of Japan stopped publishing the monthly data for sectoral bank loans, which it has been compiling and using as the basis for its credit allocation since 1942. This series has been at the core of the window guidance credit allocation process. No wonder the Bank of Japan is trying to keep these data under wraps. They are a reminder of the key tool of the Princes. Stopping the publication of such data series will make it harder for economists to analyze the economy and to assess BOJ policies.
误导和片面的宣传制作并非中央银行试图减少其问责的唯一方式。实际上，中央银行进行信息管理的空间是相当大的。任何想要监控中央银行政策的人都需要准确的信息，但是评估经济和中央银行政策所需的数据却由中央银行自身产生，这就产生了利益冲突。这种情况被经济学家和中央银行家有时表达的观点所加剧，即中央银行应对经济和其政策意图保持模糊。日本银行在这方面表现得尤为突出。1998年4月，当日本银行获得法律独立性时，停止发布了自1942年以来一直在编制并作为其信贷分配基础的部门银行贷款的月度数据。这个系列一直是窗口指导信贷分配过程的核心。难怪日本银行试图将这些数据保密，他们是王子们关键工具的提醒。停止发布此类数据系列将使经济学家更难分析经济并评估日本银行的政策。
Ironically, the Bank of Japan's Okina has admitted in his publications that statistics on credit are important and, indeed, have greater information value than other data series, such as M2 plus CD. However, he regrets that the data series are hardly useful to economists for forecasting, because they are announced too late. By the Bank of Japan. 11 The central bank, of course, has the data available in real time. Yet it has not speeded up their publication. The time lag between the end of an observation period and the publication of credit statistics remains the 2 to 3 months that were needed 30 or 40 years ago. Despite the fact that information technology has increased efficiency of data processing to the extent that real-time publication has become possible.
具有讽刺意味的是，日本银行的冲中央已在其出版物中承认信贷统计数据很重要，实际上比其他数据系列如 M2+CD 具有更大的信息价值。然而，他遗憾的是，这些数据系列对经济学家进行预测几乎没有用，因为他们被日本银行宣布的太晚。中央银行当然实时拥有这些数据，但它并未加快它们的发布。观察期结束和信贷统计数据发布之间的时间延迟仍然是30或40年前所需的2到3个月，尽管信息技术已经提高了数据处理的效率，使得实时发布成为可能。
Power in the hands of a few.
权力在少数人手中。
A governor of the Bank of Japan once reminded us that a large part of the daily transactions of households, firms, and investors are settled by means of funds transfers and remittances between banks. In turn, banks' balances are settled across their accounts held with the Bank of Japan. In other words, the majority of transactions conducted throughout the country are eventually concentrated and settled at the bank. As a result, the amount settled across the current accounts at the bank totals more than 300 trillion yen per day. This means that an amount equivalent to approximately 70% of Japan's annual GDP is transferred each day through the accounts at the bank. 12.
日本银行的一位行长曾提醒我们，家庭、公司和投资者的大部分日常交易都是通过银行间的资金转账和汇款结算的。反过来，银行的余额是通过在日本银行持有的账户结算的。换句话说，全国进行的大部分交易最终都集中在银行进行结算。因此，银行当前账户的结算金额每天超过300万亿日元。 这意味着每天通过银行账户转移的金额相当于日本年度 GDP 的约70%。
With the end of the Cold War, traditional politicians have lost out to central bankers as the driving force in the world. Central bank decisions can open the floodgates for capital flows to pour into one market and out of another, redenominating prices, quantities, and currencies. As the movement to strengthen the independence of central banks has gained momentum, the discrete individuals in dark suits, who are not known for verbosity, have become the de facto rulers over economies, countries, and regions. They create booms, busts, and crises. They reflate and deflate, appreciate and devalue, affecting the daily lives of millions of people.
随着冷战的结束，传统的政治家已经输给了中央银行家，成为世界的驱动力。中央银行的决策可以打开闸门，让资本流入一个市场，并流出另一个市场，重新定价、数量和货币。随着加强中央银行独立性的运动获得动力，那些不以多话著称的低调个体已经成为经济、国家和地区的事实上的统治者。他们创造繁荣、衰退和危机，他们通胀和紧缩、升值和贬值，影响着数百万人的日常生活。
Most observers have assumed that the Bank of Japan had wanted to create a recovery in the 1990s. The truth is, it didn't. This finding sheds new light on events that happened in other countries. We normally assume that the U.S. Federal Reserve had wanted to end the Great Depression of the 1930s, a tragedy that led to starvation in the United States and other countries. However, the Fed failed to take the policies that were necessary to create a recovery for almost a decade. Instead of intervening and implementing the policies for which it was created, namely, printing sufficient amounts of money and supporting the banks, the Fed watched as tens of thousands of banks went bankrupt, taking the savings and livelihoods of many ordinary citizens with them. Moreover, as in the 1990s in Japan, the reason for the banking crisis of the 1930s lay in the preceding decade, when the Fed allowed bank credit to rise significantly, especially credit creation used for speculative purposes. Whether we consider the quantitative policies taken by the Swedish central bank in the 1980s and 1990s or the policies of the central banks in the United States, Asian countries, or Japan, the historic fact is that central banks have been at the center of the boom and bust cycles that have plagued the world economy. With such a performance record, has it really been wise to further increase the power of central banks and decrease their accountability?
大多数观察家都认为，日本银行在1990年代希望创造经济复苏。事实是，它并没有。这个发现为其他国家发生的事件提供了新的视角。我们通常认为，美国联邦储备系统希望结束1930年代的大萧条，这场灾难导致美国和其他国家的饥荒。然而，联邦储备系统未能采取必要的政策来创造近10年的复苏。联邦储备系统没有干预并实施其创建的政策，即印制足够的货币和支持银行，而是眼睁睁地看着数以万计的银行破产，许多普通公民的储蓄和生计随之消失。此外，就像日本在1990年代一样，1930年代的银行危机的原因在于前一个10年，当时联邦储备系统允许银行信贷显著增加，特别是用于投机目的的信贷创造。无论我们考虑瑞典中央银行在1980年代和1990年代采取的数量政策，还是美国、亚洲国家或日本的中央银行的政策，历史事实是，中央银行一直处于困扰世界经济的繁荣衰退周期的中心。有了这样的业绩记录，我们真的明智地进一步增加了中央银行的权力，并减少了他们的问责吗？
Accountability and transparency.
问责与透明度。
To make central banks accountable, clear policy objectives are necessary that go beyond the narrow goal of producing low inflation. 13 Central banks should be required to avoid business cycles and achieve near full employment. The macroeconomic variable that matters to the constituency of central banks is nominal GDP growth, since it determines overall sales, profits, wages, and salaries, and, together with its gap to potential growth, prices. 14 It therefore does not make sense to require central banks to target anything else. If other variables are chosen as so-called intermediary targets, then there is immediately room for divergencies between this intermediary target and the ultimate goal that matters for most. Central bank bureaucracies could be expected to exploit these in order to reduce accountability and work towards their own interests.
为了让中央银行负责，需要明确的政策目标。 这些目标应超越产生低通胀的狭窄目标。13中央银行应被要求避免商业周期，并实现接近充分就业。对中央银行选民群体来说，重要的宏观经济变量是名义 GDP 增长，因为它决定了总销售额、利润、工资和薪水，以及与潜在增长的差距以及价格。14因此，要求中央银行目标定向其他任何事物都是没有意义的。如果选择其他变量作为所谓的中介目标，那么这个中介目标和大多数人关心的最终目标之间就会立即出现分歧。可以预期，中央银行的官僚机构会利用这些分歧来减少问责，并为自己的利益工作。
In Japan's case, the Bank of Japan could be given a nominal GDP growth target of 4%. If this goal is not met within an error margin of, for instance, 0.3 percentage points, serious and credible sanctions need to be imposed on the actual decision makers, not just the figureheads. The sanctions could include dismissal of its entire senior staff. To make this sanction credible, shadow BOJ could simultaneously be appointed consisting of experts ready to take over. There can be little doubt that under such an incentive structure, the central bank would deliver high growth with low inflation. Should the central bankers argue that they cannot meet such targets, then allow the free competition that they so admire find suitable personnel in the labor market that can. Not surprisingly, leading macroeconomists argue for nominal GDP targets for central banks. 15.
以日本为例，可以给日本银行设定 4% 的名义 GDP 增长目标。如果这个目标在误差范围内，例如 0.3个百分点内没有达到，就需要对实际决策者，而不仅仅是傀儡，施加严重且可信的制裁。制裁可能包括解雇其所有高级员工。为了使这种制裁具有可信度，可以同时任命由准备接任的专家组成的影子日本银行。毫无疑问，在这样的激励结构下，中央银行将实现高增长和低通胀。如果中央银行家们辩称他们无法达到这样的目标，那么就让他们如此崇尚的自由竞争在劳动力市场中找到合适的人员。不出所料，主要的宏观经济学家主张为中央银行设定名义 GDP 目标。15.
It would be better still if the Bank of Japan law was changed again to make the central bank directly accountable to democratically elected institutions. This is politically not easy, however, since the law was only changed in 1998. But mistakes must be acknowledged and corrected as early as possible.
如果日本银行法再次修改，使中央银行直接对民主选举的机构负责，那将更好。然而，这在政治上并不容易，因为该法仅在1998年改变。但错误必须尽早承认并纠正。
A public that is aware of the facts is likely to agree that monetary policy should be put back into the hands of democratically elected institutions. This includes ending the monopoly over information that many central banks currently enjoy. The power over collection and dissemination of data relating to banks and credit should be transferred to independent auditing institutions, which are themselves changed at intervals.
了解事实的公众可能会同意，货币政策应该重新交给民主选举的机构，这包括结束许多中央银行目前享有的信息垄断。关于银行和信贷的数据收集和传播的权利应该转交给定期更换的独立审计机构。
In Japan, an independent parliamentary commission should be appointed that closely scrutinizes the past 25 years of quantitative policies by the Bank of Japan and brings the responsible individuals to account. It is odd that dozens of bankers and bureaucrats have been arrested in the aftermath of the collapsing bubble, while those who have been truly responsible for both recession and bubble, and hence the bad debt problems of the banks, have never been called to account. The recession has produced unemployment, social dislocation, and suicides. The princes may not realize, or may not care, but they have been playing with the lives of millions of people. It is time for them to take responsibility.
在日本，应该任命一个独立的议会委员会，对日本银行过去25年的量化政策进行仔细审查，并追究责任人。令人奇怪的是，数十名银行家和官僚在泡沫破裂后被逮捕，而那些真正对经济衰退和泡沫以及银行的坏账问题负有责任的人，却从未被追究责任。经济衰退导致了失业、社会瓦解和自杀。这些王子可能没有意识到，或者可能不在乎，但他们一直在玩弄数百万人的生活。现在是他们承担责任的时候了。
Japan's economy can easily be set on course for a second economic miracle, thanks to credit creation. But as long as the actions of the princes are outside any democratic checks and balances, the princes can, if they so please, create yet another downturn, as they did in 1997 and 2001.
日本的经济可以轻易地通过信贷创造而走向第二次经济奇迹，但只要王子们的行动超出了任何民主的制衡，他们就可以，如果他们愿意，再一次创造出一个经济低迷，就像他们在1997年和2001年所做的那样。